We turn now to the music and careers of Michael Jackson and Madonna, two artists who, in that first few years of the development of MTV, really helped define not only what MTV was going to be, but how successful it could be as a force in the music business and as a way of bringing artists to their audience and bringing the audience to the artist. Both of these artists were very, very popular, and both benefited a lot from MTV experience because both Michael Jackson and Madonna depend to a certain extent on the visual presentation. There is a certain amount of theater and live performance in a Michael Jackson record and a Madonna performance. You've got to see what it is that she's doing. You've got to see how she's juxtaposing images in various kinds of things. Michael Jackson, you've got to see what he's doing with the dance moves. It's all integral in that kind of way. And so for them, MTV was perfect. The music of both artists often depended on dance beats and hook-laden melodies and songs like that, and they certainly blended plenty of dance into video performances. Both of them also sort of arise out of the disco scene, which I said we wanted to keep our eye on. Disco in many ways began to fade in the beginning of the 1980s, but the idea of songs that could be played especially for dancing or that were based on dance beats continued to play a big part in popular music during the 80s, even if it wasn't thought of as particularly as disco music, the dance beat kind of thing. Disco brought the dance beat kind of idea back, starting in 1977, as we said, with the breakthrough of Saturday Night Fever, and then by the end of the decade, the fad for disco was kind of over, but the idea of having music that was particularly good on the dance floor was not. So let's turn to the music of Michael Jackson. Of course, we've talked about him before as a child star with the Jackson 5 in the mid-70s, the Jackson 5, leaving Motown Records and moving to a new label, renaming themselves as the Jacksons. Michael Jackson also launched a solo career more as an adult now, and his 1979 album Off the Wall was a fantastic success for him. We talked about that in our discussion of disco. It's his first album teaming up with Quincy Jones producing, and you got two big singles on that record. Many successful singles, but the two biggies are Rock With Me and Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. I've said before, I think maybe Off the Wall may be the very best of all the disco records. It's a fantastic record from beginning to end. And as successful as it was, it still wasn't successful enough to suit Michael Jackson. So in 1983, he comes back with the album Thriller, which is #1 in this country, #1 in the UK. It's a fantastically successful record with all kinds of singles that make the top 5. It's just, it's almost easier to count the songs on the album that weren't hit singles than to list off all of those that were, although I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. The important #1 single, one of the most important #1 singles on Thriller was the single Billie Jean, which we've already talked about, and making it onto MTV on March the 10th, 1983. So let's think about dates here for a minute. If MTV launched on August the 1st of 1981, and Michael Jackson's Billie Jean makes it onto the airwaves there in March of 1983, it means there's a period of about 18 months where that MTV station is sort of doing its sort of Wayne's World audience thing before Michael Jackson actually hits. So there's that period of time. We're talking about early 1983 when that video hits, and especially after Michael performs Billie Jean on the Motown 25, the big anniversary network television show that was broadcast in May of 1983. That's that famous broadcast that you've probably seen on the internet where he does the moonwalk for the first time. Oh, it was such a sensation when he did Billie Jean. He did the moonwalk. Everybody, they were like, what, did you hear it? Remember, these were days where you couldn't just have the VCR and say, oh yeah, well I can go get that show on demand. Let's look at it again. If you didn't see it when it was on, you didn't see it. But you could see the Billie Jean video. It was on MTV by that time, had been for a couple of months, and so now the whole excitement about seeing Michael Jackson do his thing really began to mount, and so we get the rise of MTV that goes along with the success of this gigantic album. But as Quincy Jones has said many times, Michael Jackson and MTV kind of pushing both up pushing each other up as these years unfold. Here are some other singles from that album. Want to Be Starting Something was number 5. Human Nature was number 7. PYT, or Pretty Young Thing, was number 10. I think it's interesting to look at this album for crossover appeal, remembering that Michael Jackson came from Motown and was schooled by Berry Gordy Jr. and understood the importance of crossing over to a white audience. That's what that whole debate about Billie Jean had been, getting him on MTV. And so he reaches out with Thriller. He does a song together with Paul McCartney, The Girl Is Mine. Not the first thing that he did with Paul McCartney, but this was a number 2 hit for him. And then on the number 1 hit, Beat It, he invites sort of rock guitar icon Eddie Van Halen to do the guitar solo, and Eddie Van Halen appears in the video. So you can see, I mean, if you're going to reach across to a white rock audience, the kind of people who are, you know, listening to FM rock radio and watching MTV before the Billie Jean video hits, you get a sort of a hard rock, sort of proto-heavy metal guitar virtuoso like Eddie Van Halen, and the most visible and popular Beatle at the time, Paul McCartney. It's not a bad strategy for crossing over, and it crossed over pretty effectively. Another single on that album was the number 4 single, Thriller, which now starts to give us a sense, the Thriller and the video for Thriller starts to give us a sense of the ambition that's starting to make its way into MTV videos. The record company spent $500,000 to make the video for Thriller, which runs, I think, about 10, 12 minutes, something like that. It was directed by John Landis, a fully fledged, you know, major motion picture director. He directed things like National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978 and the Blues Brothers movie in 1980. So they get a real director, a real film crew, they spend $500,000 and they make a video to play on MTV. Well, of course, Michael Jackson's Thriller, that album, was making tons of money, so they had money to spend. But the thing is, it becomes more than just a song. The video itself becomes what you have to see. It's like what the stage shows started to become. You know, there are dance movements and coordinated dance troupe and all kinds of things. Nobody ever seen anything like that. Here's where the hippie aesthetic and the idea of ambition, though it seems to have been snuffed out at the end of the 70s with concept albums and all this big progressive rock music and all, it really starts to come back with a lot of these videos where people start to think, well, here's where we could get ambitious, here's where we could get artsy, here's where we could do something nobody's ever done before in the way that we present these things according to video. And Thriller is really one of the important markers along the way to increasingly ambitious video, and we'll talk more about those as we go along. Well, Michael Jackson continues in the 1980s to have tremendous success. His number 1 album, Bad, has got 7 hit singles on it, 5 of which went to number 1, including the title song, Bad, and Man in the Mirror. The 80s were in many ways the decade of Michael Jackson. His subsequent tragic death and some of the things the scandals that swirled around him later in his life may take our attention away from how big and how important and how popular he was in the 1980s. In many ways, you could probably argue that Michael Jackson was the Beatles of the 80s, was to the 80s what the Beatles were to the 60s. Let's turn now to the music of Madonna. She was born and raised in Michigan. I think I mentioned before, Michael Jackson coming from Gary, Indiana originally, the Jackson family coming from Gary. So Madonna, being born in Bay City, Michigan, which is actually not too far from Gary, Indiana, you probably make it by car in about 2.5 hours from the 2 places in Indiana and Michigan. Anyway, she makes it to the Detroit area, the area that's now Rochester Hills, Pontiac, that area is where she grew up. Ended up going to the University of Michigan on a dance scholarship, but didn't finish, moved to New York because she wanted to be a professional dancer. Worked as a waitress. I think Dunkin' Donuts is what I've read. She did that, and you know, tried to get in to as a dancer to various Broadway shows, various productions, and didn't have as much success with that as she had sort of forming bands and groups and sort of doing things with music. And so she decided to go in the direction of pursuing the music thing instead of, you know, professional dancer in New York. Her first album, Madonna, from 1983, did not do so bad. It was on the label Sire, which was a New York label that had produced records by a lot of the punk and new wave artists coming out of the New York scene. Anyway, the Madonna album went to number 8. She had 2 pretty good hits on it, Holiday, a number 16 hit, and Lucky Star, a number 4 hit. But if you listen to those records, you really do hear sort of early 80s post-disco there. In other words, you don't really hear the edginess of what Madonna would become with the next album. She was one of a number of artists doing songs that were great on the dance floor, that were sort of happy, a kind of a girlish voice, you know, no sense of danger, just a lot of fun and that kind of thing, and really no sense of confrontation in any of that music. But with 1984's Like a Virgin, all of that changes. All of a sudden, it's like Madonna decides that she doesn't just want to be a great dancer singing hit songs for AM radio and for dance clubs. She wants to do something a little bit more ambitious. She wants to challenge. At first, she wants to challenge, but she also wants to shock. She wants to do things that are going to, I think the most sympathetic interpretation would be, shock us out of our complacency. Whatever ideas we have about what a woman should be in this society, she's going to take those ideas and she's going to subvert them in ways that are going to cause us to question the value of those things to begin with. So she is a kind of a disruption, sort of shock artist at the beginning. That album, Like a Virgin, as I say, a number 1 album with her. Lots of hits on that record. Like a Virgin was a number 1 hit, Material Girl a number 2 hit, Angel a number 5 hit, Dress You Up a number 5 hit. But one of the most important things about that record is her performance of Like a Virgin at the MTV Video Music Awards in 1984. You should find that video on the internet. It is her starting out the performance atop a wedding cake in the wedding dress that she's wearing on the cover of the record. But then she comes down off the thing and it very quickly becomes almost a kind of a pole dance. I mean, it becomes extremely sexy, extremely sensual, provocative. You begin to wonder whether we're going to be able to, you know, continue to broadcast this. She was doing everything she could short of actually taking the dress off and becoming a stripper. And the whole idea was to take the idea of the virginal bride and the sexual woman and to juxtapose them against each other. She starts off as one thing on top of the cake, and then she turns into something else. As a way of sort of maybe challenging men's expectations of women, wanting them to be virginal and, you know, the perfect mother on one side, you know, when they're in their regular life, but in the bedroom they should turn into, you know, some sort of, you know, sexual animal or a tigress or whatever. And so she puts that all up in front of us and just sort of shock people. I mean, stories of people who are, when you shock musicians, you know you're shocking people. You know, and they're saying, you know, I can't believe she was doing this. My mouth was wide open. It really launched Madonna not only as a megastar of the album, but this performance launched her as an artist of some controversy. She continues through the decade to have fantastic success. True Blue is a number 1 album in 1986, 3 number 1 singles, including Papa Don't Preach, plus 2 more number 5 singles. Like a Prayer from 1989, another number 1 album with the Like a Prayer song being a number 1 hit, plus 2 more number 2 singles. If you don't know the video for Like a Prayer, that's another really controversial video. There are burning crosses. There's at one point Madonna has stigmata on her hands. There's a gospel choir, and there's what seems to suggest fantasy sex with a religious icon of a saint. What she's doing there is really sort of juxtaposing sex, guilt, the body, religion, spirituality. All of those things are sort of brought together, but of course, very controversial. I think even drawing criticism from the Vatican on that. She spent some time in movies, 1985's Desperately Seeking Susan, and she played in the Dick Tracy movie opposite Warren Beatty in 1990. So Madonna, again, like Michael Jackson, a fantastically successful career in the 1980s. She became a fashion hero for young girls early on. The Like a Virgin period, a lot of girls were dressing up to look just like Madonna, that kind of thing, almost a kind of a teeny bopper kind of fad with kids. But the more important thing is that she became a role model for female artists. Madonna was somebody who took control of her career and seemed to be in control of it. She gave women a new sense that they could not only they didn't need to just participate in the popular music business. They could be movers and shakers. They could be controllers. They could be decision makers. They could be in control of the process. Madonna casts a very long shadow for women in the history of rock music and pop music after her, and I think that may be the most crucial thing about these years. Did she use her role as a sex object to question sort of ideas about culture and all that kind of thing? I think that she did. Was there a certain aspect of her taking advantage of the titillation factor to get herself attention? I think that's true too. I don't think it was just that. I think that Madonna is a smart woman who knows how to shock us to get us to think about some of our assumptions at a time when the culture really was changing in many important and interesting kinds of ways. Popular music can be helpful in that way because it brings these messages to large numbers of people. And if you do it in an attractive show business kind of way, it's also entertaining. So in many ways, I think Madonna a pivotal figure. So we've talked a bit now, at length, about Michael Jackson and Madonna. Let's move on to the next video to maybe what you might think of as the continuation or the expansion of these ideas and talk about the music of Prince and Janet Jackson.